Okay, so I'm going to say who I mean by the term disabled people. I'm just going to give a very brief update on some of the kind of key experiences that we as a community face. And I mean me because I'm also a disabled woman. Um, and then we are going to talk about, well, why is the case? Why do disabled people lead the lives that we lead? And that's going to move on to kind of how society treats and views disabled people and thinks about disability. And then we'll move on to organisations. So, okay, without further ado, disabled people, what do I mean when I use the term disabled people? Well, this term covers every group of people with different impairments. So I mean by the term disabled people, people with physical impairments, visual impairments, deaf people. So, and I use a capital D there because that's for BSL users. So that's deaf people who use British Sign Language, but also it's people who have acquired a hearing impairment. It's people, oh, okay, it's people with learning difficulties, people with mental health issues, or people who experience mental distress, people with long-term health conditions, people who are neurodivergent, and people with hidden impairments or, oh, okay.
Just trying to so that it was bigger on the screen for everyone.
Right, okay. I'm just now need to figure out how I
Oh,
can move to the next one. That's fine.
sorry.
Okay, I can do it. Yes, that's good. Okay, so disabled people. So basically, disabled people, it's not just wheelchair users. It's not just blind people. Disabled people, the term I use covers all of the various and diverse groups of people that have impairments. And I'm going to talk a bit later about what I mean by impairment. So there are about 13.3 million disabled people in the UK, which is roughly about 20% of the population, so 1 in 5. So we're not an insignificant group in society. And in London alone, there's 1.3 million of us. Okay, so very briefly, and I know you know this, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. We know that things are getting worse for disabled people, not better. And that's a result, quite a kind of a particular situation of historic exclusion and discrimination. So what I mean by that is that disabled people have, throughout the decades and hundreds of years, always been at the bottom of the pile, always been disadvantaged, excluded, discriminated against. And again, I'll get onto why that is the case. So you've got that historic exclusion, but on top of that, we've had, and we're seeing, and all the evidence shows that there is really significant rising poverty and inequality as a result of at least 12 years of austerity now. I've got a quote here. It says, a grave and systematic violation of disabled people's rights. Well, that is a direct quote from the UN Disability Committee, and they carried out a 2-year investigation into the impact of welfare reforms on disabled people, and that was their conclusion. And then in 2017, we gave evidence to the UN Disability Committee about the government's failure to uphold disabled people's rights, and they were equally damning. Okay, so, we know we're twice as likely to live in poverty and be unemployed, and those unemployment rates go through the roof if you're talking about people with learning difficulties, deaf people, and people who experience mental distress. We know that, day-to-day barriers are still out there, whether it's public transport, moving around the street, accessing shops, goods and services. We know exclusion is on the increase. People are more marginalised, isolated at home. We know more and more disabled children are being excluded from mainstream education. And we know that basically, whatever way you look at it, disabled people are having poorer outcomes. We also know that hate crime against disabled people, which is really appallingly underreported and therefore not really recognised, is significantly increasing. And I think one of the key backdrops to the situation getting worse is the massive reduction in statutory support. So more and more disabled people just aren't eligible for any form of statutory support, whether that's benefits or things like social care. And we know that, that the third sector, the community, voluntary sector have been decimated by austerity cuts as well. So just kind of, I think it's worth trying to move on, and I can't seem to move my screen now.
Sorry, shall I move it to the next slide?
Yeah. Great. Okay. I think somebody's taken control over my.
Sorry, shall I give you control back?
It's all right. I can just tell you to move the slides if that's okay, Louise. So I just think, just very briefly, I think what the kind of experience of the pandemic for our community, just again, a bit like with the BAME community, just reveals how deep and structural our disadvantage and discrimination is. So the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, have twice reported now that 6 out of 10 deaths are disabled people. We know that COVID has revealed some really deep things. So there's a lot of stuff happening over the last year that really does show that we are not valued as equals. So, we had that phenomenon of care homes, both for older people, but also for people with learning difficulties, people just getting issued with photocopied do not resuscitate notices. We had NICE guidelines developed that basically said if you need support with personal care, then you're not going to get to hospital and you're not going to receive intensive care if you get COVID. Those guidelines were challenged, they were revised, but it, again, revealing of a whole way of thinking about disabled people that just assumes that we're of less value. Social care was ignored. DPOs throughout London have consistently said our voice has just not been heard. We haven't been consulted. We haven't been asked what our needs are. There's been no guidance, for example, if you are on direct payments and want to keep yourself and your assistants safe. And I think a really telling example is that unlike Wales and Scotland, where the First Ministers with their daily COVID briefings had a British Sign Language interpreter present, the UK government, Boris Johnson, chose not to do that. We then had lots of issues around just the lack of access to food, to health and social care, and that's becoming a really important issue at the moment, but also PPE. We know that there's been a massive drop-off about benefit applications and appeals, and we know that, so many face-to-face services have been shut over the past year with we know that there's a tsunami of need kind of building up. We've seen an active erosion of our rights, and we know that issues around isolation, lack of support, and increasing mental health distress is a really big issue. And we know that shielding is still live, even though the government have announced there's no longer no need to shield. We know that many thousands of disabled people are still being advised to shield, and yet they have no legal status, they have no protection under law. And some CAB research back in August said that if you were deemed clinically extremely vulnerable, you were 48% more likely to be made redundant than somebody who was not in that category. Next slide, please. So that's all a bit grim. So why is this the case? And I want to, one of the key messages that I really hope I can get across to you is that it's that we are living those lives because of how society thinks about disability and disabled people. So all of what I've just described is not inevitable, but a direct result of how disabled people are viewed and treated in society. And underpinning that are two key, critical, and radically different ways of thinking about disability. And that's what I'm going to get onto now. Next slide, please, Louise. So, firstly, I want to kind of give you an overview of the current, the historic, and still the prevalent model and understanding of disability. Generally, it's called the medical model, but often it's called the individual or deficit model. In short, as I hope this diagram shows, it's very much, this model is focused on going, this is an individual problem, and this is about a group of people who can't do things. So they can't talk, they can't hear, they're mentally ill, they're less intelligent, they can't walk, they have special needs, they might be bound to a wheelchair. All of this focus, it assumes, and it's focused on the individual and apparently what they can, what they can't do. Next slide, please. So under this kind of medical model, which is still the model, the dominant model, disability is about having something wrong with you. Disabled people at best have special needs and need special things, like we need to go to day centres, we need special schools, we need special transport. The assumption is that we cannot live lives like normal people. We aren't able to exercise choice and control. We can't kind of have the relationships that other people have. We can't hold down a job. You know, all of the things that, you know, come under the banner normal, the assumption is we can't do to various degrees. And as I said, disability is an individual issue. It's a kind of, isn't that really unfortunate, that poor person, look at them, what they can and can't do. So the kind of traditional response to disability when you view it like this is A, trying to cure people or make them as normal as possible. And there's a really nice analogy here. We know that there is a phenomenon that Black people, some Black people in response to racism have tried to whiten their skin, and kind of skin whitening products are, you know, a real live thing in this world. But likewise, we know that for many people with Down syndrome, slightly less now, but they used to go through completely unnecessary cosmetic surgery to make themselves physically look more normal. So there's this massive pressure on being as normal as possible, trying to do things in the same way as normal people. So rather than going, hey, you've got no legs, just learn to walk in whatever best ways fit for you, they made kids kind of have really clunky kind of plastic legs, you name it. It's all about that unspoken assumption that we need to make these people as normal as possible. And if they can't be made as normal as possible, which is generally the case, then it's about treating them differently with pity, charity, and sympathy, but often actually with hostility as well. So next slide, please. So this has been the prevalent thinking forever, you know, and I became a disabled person when I was 15, and I went through a whole kind of medical rehab situation, actually never saw another disabled person in any position of power. And it was all of that thinking. I was kind of sat down and told what I couldn't do, basically, of what I would never be able to do. So this is the experience, but it's changed, and it changed because disabled people got together. So the disabled people's rights movement has been going for about 40 years, and it's inspired by the great civil rights movements of the 50s, 60s and 70s. The Black civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBT rights movement. And there was a guy called Paul Hunt, who was a disabled guy with a physical impairment, who at the time was living in a Leonard Cheshire long stay hospital. So he was living on a ward. He was made to go to bed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon because that's when the night matron came on shift. And he thought, why the hell am I living like this? You know, this is a prison situation. I'm not ill, and I'm not, I'm not, you know, I'm not a criminal. Why am I living with no choice, no control over my life, locked away in an institution? And so he wrote a famous letter, I think it was to the Guardian, saying, why am I in this situation? This is a civil rights abuse too. Just like so many other marginalised communities are fighting to reclaim their humanity and their equality, the same applies to disabled people. And that started the disabled people's rights movement. I'm going to get on to kind of some of the characteristics of our movement, but absolutely at the heart of it is, firstly, it's a movement that's run by and for disabled people. So there's a whole range of images here. These are, from the left, some of the earliest civil rights direct action protests, blocking buses back in the 90s. There's actually me. I didn't mean it to be me on this photo, but in front of the Royal Courts of Justice, I think, when we were trying to challenge the closure of the Independent Living Fund. And there's some been recent protests as well around welfare reform. So, you know, at the heart of the disabled people's rights movement is the fact that it's run and controlled by disabled people, not the old disability charities that were quite happy to perpetuate that medical model, deficit model. Some of you might be old enough to remember that, you know, in the shop entrance, to the entrance to most shops in like the 1970s, you would have the statue of the girl with calipers on, and you would stick, you know, a 2-penny piece in the top of her head. So that imagery was all pervasive, and the charities were quite happy to peddle it, basically. So along came the disabled people's rights movement, and I'll talk a bit later about how profound our movement's been, but here it's summed up. You know, it's a journey from workhouse to workplace. So we were disabled people, if they did have employment, were locked away in special supported employment factories, often under appalling conditions. There's now, although it's still really bad, the rates of unemployment, disabled people have got, you know, our workplaces are more inclusive. And we've gone from institutions like where Paul Hunt was locked up to actually independent living, even though that's being really threatened at the moment. And we've gone from charity to human rights. At the heart, though, I'd probably say, along with disabled people's self-organisation, the most important thing that the disabled people's rights movement has done has developed an alternative model to thinking about disability that is radically different from the medical model. So next slide, please, Louise. So this is the social model of disability. And at the heart of it, what this does is completely flip that medical individual model that I was talking about. What the social model does is say that there is nothing inevitable about the lives that disabled people lead. There's nothing like, if you're blind, then you're never going to have a job, you're never going to have a relationship, you're never going to be a parent. You know, most of society thinks that's inevitable. If you're a disabled person, if you can't do X and Y or Z, you know, your life's over. What the social model was saying, there is nothing inevitable there. It cut that link and said the lives that disabled people are leading are a result not of the bits of their mind or their brain or their body that works differently. It's a result of the way that society is run and organised. So it's a design of buildings that excludes wheelchair users. It's a design of the transport system that excludes us and stops us having freedom of travel. It's the lack of rights that we have. It's segregated and often very poor education. It's the refusal of employers to be inclusive. That means that's why we're not employed. It's the attitudes about us being childlike or a burden or, you know, worrying or evil, you name it. It's about how society is run and organised that actually creates the lives that we're leading. And that is amazingly radical. And I'll next slide, please, Louise, and I'll kind of attempt to kind of tell you why. So what the social model is saying is that it's the economic, social, physical, communication and attitudinal barriers that stop disabled people from participating fully in society and having the choice and control that others have. So it is actually society that disables people with impairments, people who have different bodies, different brains, different minds. And we predominantly have a problem, not because our bodies or minds work in a different way, but because society's chosen to view us in a particular way. And because of that, we have a problem about discrimination, exclusion, prejudice, and loss of human rights. That's our problem. That's our primary problem, not our impairment itself. So actually what the social model says is that disability is created by society, the way it's organised, the way it disadvantages, excludes disabled people, like it did women, like it does Black people. Society is run in a way that disadvantages and marginalises certain groups. And so what the social model says is the right response to disability is not to try and change individual disabled people by making them look more normal and all of that stuff. It's actually by changing society. It's about ending discrimination. It's about removing the barriers and creating inclusion and equality. And the great thing about that response is that it's actually possible because society is a social construct. Society changes all the time. Half of us in this virtual room together wouldn't have been allowed in a public space 100 years ago. So, you know, society is constantly changing and we can change it too. Next slide, please, Ruth. So, again, just to reiterate, what the social model says is that just because our bodies, brains, or minds work in different ways doesn't mean we can't lead a good life. Just because we're different, it doesn't mean that we have to lead worse lives than others. If barriers are removed and support put in place, we can lead lives of equality and inclusion like every other citizen should have. So obviously, we're not going to pretend that, you know, we can do everything that somebody else can do. No human being can pretend to do that. There's huge diversity, huge difference, but just because we have a particular impairment, it doesn't mean that we are doomed to lead disadvantaged and, you know, poor lives. Next slide, please. This is tea, by the way, not white wine. So the social model is about change, and it shows, and it's not just saying, look, you know, let's think about disability in a different way, but it's also the roadmap for showing you how to make that change. So it's saying there's nothing inevitable here. Just like, you know, 200 years ago, you know, society used to say, oh, women, they're a fairer sex, they're not able to run or to hold down a job because they're too weak and, you know, get hysterical. You know, there's a lot of that essentializing of women, like there's essentializing of Black people. But, you know, that is wrong, and it's proven to be wrong. And the same applies to disabled people. A lot of that essentializing, saying, oh, you couldn't possibly ever live on your own, you know, is wrong. So discrimination and loss of opportunity is not inevitable, and that barriers can be removed. And that, importantly, also, we must be, as disabled people, fully involved in that change. Next slide, please. So I said that the social model is a kind of roadmap to kind of understanding not just our experience in the world, but also how to get to somewhere better. And we do that, and the social model does that by focusing in on the barriers operating in society. And once you can identify the barriers, you are then much better placed to take action to remove those barriers. So I'm briefly going to talk through some of the key structural barriers that are operating at the moment that disadvantage disabled people. And of course, I need to keep saying that this is a really intersectional experience, and all of these barriers are actually barriers that other marginalised communities experience as well, maybe in different ways, but you know, there's a lot of commonality there. So attitudinal barriers are really profound and some of the kind of deepest barriers that we still continue to face. So some of those, what I mean by that is the attitudes that society has about us. So, and they're often really contradictory, and they're often completely unexamined and just are in people's heads and in the organisations and the networks that we run as a society. So there's fear, there's othering, you know, we're viewed as the other. We are viewed as of being less value, which is kind of hence the photocopy do not resuscitate notices. We can be viewed as childlike, which is particularly a barrier that people with learning difficulties face. We can be viewed as tragic and in need of pity. And, you know, the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And there's a lot of non-disabled people who you know, throughout the years have attempted to do good, but are actually just perpetuating those ideas that we're kind of tragic and in need of sympathy and pity. But likewise, so you've got all of that stuff going on, but you've got, and particularly in this last 10 years of austerity, you've had some really quite contradictory attitudes there as well, that we're unproductive, that we're a burden on society, that we take, that we don't give, that we're undeserving, as well as we can be a blessing. And I think, you know, the role of disabled people, say, in some kind of religions as a kind of, you know, a way of teaching other people lessons is another example of us not being viewed as innately valued equal human beings, but as something that other people project onto. So you've got a whole range of attitudinal barriers, You've then got physical, environmental barriers. So that's everything from steps, inaccessible transport, inaccessible housing, which is a massive deal in London and throughout the country. Got just a lack of public loos. So many loos have been shut down in the last 10, 15 years. Broken lifts. It could be lighting. It could be the lack of drop curbs. It could be street furniture. You name it, lots and lots of physical environmental barriers. We then have lots of communication and information barriers. And I think particularly and again through this pandemic, the digital exclusion that particularly disabled people face is going to be an increasingly, really serious issue, where if you can't get online, you're not going to access, support, benefits, apps, you name it. But it can also be about just running your information with plain text, not having it in other formats, not having interpreters available, whether they're community language interpreters or British Sign Language interpreters. You then have the socio-economic barriers that obviously kind of run underneath, but also are a result of these other barriers. So disabled people are more likely to be in poverty, to have a poor education experience, live in a poor housing, and we've been again under a system of punitive benefits that we know through things like sanctions actually make people iller rather than actually supporting them. And finally, there's a whole set of organisational and cultural barriers. That can be summed up in like, well, that's not how things are done here. So you've got whole etiquettes and just ways of doing things that are unexamined and are not accessible and exclude people. And you also have things, policies. So hot desking was a big thing in the last 10 years. It's a nightmare for disabled people. Likewise, timed appointments. Many of us need extra time, double appointments. Again, there's lots and lots of different organisational ways of doing things that discriminate. Right, I wanted to kind of just, before I kind of take a breath, just wanted to kind of go back and kind of really reiterate something that is absolutely at the heart of the social model, which is creating and revealing that distinction between impairment and disability. So let me just be really honest with you. Impairment's not a particularly nice word, but what it is, it's an attempt, when we use it from a social model understanding, it's an attempt to distinguish between what is the bit of our brain, body or mind that works differently. And it's an attempt to distinguish that kind of biological difference with disability, which, as I've said, is the removal, limitation or restriction of opportunities and rights experienced by people with impairment. So disability is the discrimination that people with impairments experience. Impairment is the biological thing, and disability is the social consequence of having an impairment in society. So that takes some time to think through, and it still really is a cause of much confusion. It's a difficult concept, we're all taught disability, disability is disability, you're disabled, you can't do something. What the social model is saying is that can't do something. Most of what that can't do is not based on the impairment, but it's based on the way society is organised and structured. Next slide, please, Louise. So, as I said, the difference, why is this so important, distinguishing between impairment and disability? It's important because revealing that difference between impairment and disability shows just how much what we can't do is a result of society and the way we are treated rather than the inevitable result of our impairment. So just final couple of slides of this slot.
Next one, yeah.
Yes, please.
Sorry.
No worries. So understanding that leads on to a really central point around language. So the term disabled people, from a social model perspective, is not saying, you know, I'm disabled before I'm a human being. What it is saying disabled people is a political term people with impairments use to emphasize the social cause and nature of exclusion, prejudice, and discrimination people with impairments face. So people with impairments are disabled by society. And what having one kind of banner, disabled people, what it does is it creates that connection between all those various groups of people with different impairments. The list that I read out right at the beginning of my presentation, you know, there's lots and lots of diversity in that, and social model is not actually kind of commenting on the detail of people's impairments or the experience they have maybe of deteriorating, fluctuating conditions or pain. But what it's saying is regardless, and this is true, regardless of the detail, the lived experience of that particular impairment, all people with impairments experience those barriers in society to greater or lesser degrees, and in generally, you know, the same barriers, maybe in slightly different ways. So a deaf person will need a BSL interpreter, a person with learning difficulties might need easy read. So they've got different access needs, but the same barrier is operating. So using the term disabled people is a rallying call. It's a political term that unites all of these people with impairments together and saying, we as a group of people with lots of diverse impairments, we face very broadly the same crap deal in this society. And we're disabled by society and we want to change society. So that's why when, you know, the common term, which is people with disabilities, that's why this is a kind of, from a political point of view, a just kind of wrong term, because what people with disabilities does, it confuses disability and impairment. You can't be a person with a social construct. You can't be a person with a that has a you know, a kind of societal disadvantage in that way. You know, what we're saying is that you can be a person with an impairment, but the disability is the social consequences of that. And talking about people with disabilities confuses those two categories. And one of the most powerful and radical things that the social model does is insist on separating what is the biological difference from the social consequences of having it. That's why people with disabilities is actually, it perpetuates ultimately a medical model understanding. So that's why and I totally acknowledge there's lots and lots of disabled people out there that don't use that term, but I would say that's because they're not politicised yet. That, you know, there's lots of, that's why we say the term disabled people, not people with disabilities. So what kind of the thinking was that I'm happy to answer any information points or questions you have now. I can see that there's kind of 8 points in the chat, but after the break, we wanted you to go into the breakout rooms and just kind of talk particularly about the social model, and the kind of impairment disability thing. And we've got a couple of slides with some kind of questions, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have before we do that. Or do people want to go straight for the break?
Question, Tracy. I did put it in the chat. You know, the first slide, you said 13.3 million people?
Yes.
What date was that data? I presume it was the last census, not this census.
Yeah. I have a feeling it might be 13.3 or 13.8 million people, but it is the latest information, yeah.
Right, okay. So that would have been the census 10 years ago, basically.
No, that's been more recent information than that,
That's
yeah.
from the ONS, Office of National Statistics, that data.
Sorry, say that again?
Oh, sorry, that data was from the ONS, Office of National Statistics?
That data was about the number of COVID deaths that were disabled people.
Right.
But if you do, there's a number of things from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, right through to the government website has data, and the ONS does have data on how many disabled people are living in the UK.
Sure. Thank you. No, thank you, Tracy, for that. Thank you.
So I've got a good question here about what about the psychosocial model of disability. I'm happy to answer that now, or if people want a break and come back to that.
I think now might be Matt.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, so that's a really interesting question, because what's happening at the same time as austerity was the development of something called the biopsychosocial model of disability. And DPAC, Disabled People Against Cuts, did some really interesting research about the origins of this kind of supposed new model of disability. And that model actually came out of the insurance industry in America. And what it was an attempt to do was to say, yes, we do recognise there are kind of some barriers in society, but actually, and we know that there's impairment, but actually we also believe that there's a big psychological element. And that was used, this new form of this new model was used to basically exclude disabled people from accessing health insurance in America, because it was deemed to be basically it's your attitude, you're choosing to be helpless or unable to do X, Y, and Z. So therefore, we are not going to support you. And that was the interpretation of this model. And I'm totally up for thinking that there are other kind of models, but that was the interpretation kind of brought over and used within the first welfare reforms, that basically said, we believe this is an attitudinal thing on the part of the individual, and therefore it justified the sanctions regime, for example, and conditionality. So really, we would say that that's actually the latest iteration of the individual medical model, just kind of made to look a bit, you know, to give a nod to the social model. So it gives a bit of cover to people. But, you know, I think that the question here is about alienation from society can produce mental and social issues. Absolutely. And I think, you know, there's some interesting challenges to the social model, because the social model often has just been really crudely applied, and it's just kind of ramps. It's just ramps and buses kind of thing. And we need to do a lot more work to understand how, for example, the barriers operate to exclude people with mental distress, and what the kind of feedback loop is. But the social model is not there to explain impairment, it's there to explain the social consequences of impairment in society at the moment.
Thank you, Tracy.